Mexico is not as dominant as it once was as a sending country, and yet you see huge increases in migrants from all over the world. So the substitution story is one where immigrants are coming in and taking jobs from natives. That would be they're substituting. Another story, but that's not the only story that could happen. They also could be complements. And so, that's sometimes where you see more of the animosity. But again, actually, economic research would explain some of that's the group, those are the groups that tend to be the most adversely affected. I think the other thing is this assumption that if immigrant labor goes away, that it will be replaced by native-born workers, and that's going to happen through wages adjusting upward.
Today's guest is an economist, Sarah Pearlman. She focuses on developmental economics of Latin American countries, and she also co-authored multiple papers on immigration to the United States. Given that this is a new channel, I need your help to help push this video into the algorithms. So if you'd consider giving this video a thumbs up or leaving a comment down below, I would really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Professor Pearlman, thank you so much for joining me on my podcast. I'm excited to explore a big question today and get to the bottom whether or not immigrants are good or bad for the American economy. I was thinking we could get started and get just an overview of who are the immigrants in the United States. What do they do?
Yeah. Thank you, Adrina, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. The answer to, who immigrants are in the U.S. has been changing in the past 20 years. This is something that I've seen through recent research with some Vassar students. Of course, the largest foreign-born population in the U.S. is from Mexico. That remains the dominant group. Off the top of my head, I don't have numbers, but at the peak, there were an estimated 12.5 million Mexican-born migrants living in the U.S. Since the Great Recession, that's fallen by about 1 million, so it's about 11.5, could be below that. It got down to probably about 10 and a bit. So there was a big decline through the Great Recession and a little bit of recovery. But what's been interesting is that the decline in the Mexican population in the U.S., you've not seen from any other country. You've seen increases in populations from almost everywhere else. So I worked with a student this past summer, and, we looked at data from the U.S. on, 100 some other countries. And in almost every one, the population in the U.S. has increased. And we see this just even looking at U.S. data sets on people who have arrived in the past year, so really recent. And so that's where you see the clear decline in migration flows from Mexico and clear increases from everywhere else. Some of this are, I think, more well-documented ones from other parts of Latin America. So that's gotten a lot of press, right? So the increase in migrants from Venezuela, for example, increase in migrants from different countries in Central America. That has received a lot of press also because of people showing up at the southern border, right? So in terms of the border crisis, you see that reflected in narratives around those groups, but also countries that are not getting a lot of press, like the second largest foreign-born population in the U.S. now is from India. I assumed it was China after Mexico. Of course, China is close behind, but it's a really big population. And, we looked at how many states in the U.S. had received a migrant from India just in the past year, and it's really high. So this is a population that's also moving beyond, let's say, a handful of cities with large networks to, being much more widespread. Similar story about the Chinese-born population. We looked at Nepal. There was 1,000% increase in the Nepalese population over the past 20 years. I mean, really interesting, various countries in Africa. So I think my big takeaway from this is that, come back to your original question, what does the immigrant population in the U.S. look like? Um, it is becoming more diverse than it has been in the past. Again, that Mexico is not as dominant as it once was as a sending country, and yet you see huge increases in migrants from all over the world. Yeah. So I think a very interesting story about what's happening to the migrant population in the US. And again, this is not just select cities. You see this kind of across different cities and states.
Mm-hmm. Do we have any information on the breakdown in terms of what positions migrants end up working in, whether it's primarily low wage positions, or is distribution becoming more diverse in that regard as well?
Yeah. So what we do know, and I should start by saying that the main source of these data are the U.S. Census Bureau that conducts annual surveys, kind of snapshots of the population in between the very large biennial census, right? That's every 10 years, but that's a massive undertaking. And between those 10 years, you want to know something about what's happening to the population.
Mhm.
So this is something called the American Community Survey. This is easily accessible, which is really wonderful. So anyone can go download these data and poke around to answer these questions. So if you're interested in a particular occupation or a particular industry or a particular sending country or location in the US, you can, go in and download the data and calculate statistics. So I don't have off the top of my head, you know, industries where we see these changes are the largest. What I can say is that the composition along educational lines has been changing, that the immigrant population has a higher percentage of people with a college degree or more than before. So
Mhm.
we have definitely seen a decline in less well-educated migrants, so people with less than a college degree, usually high school or less, and a rise in immigrants with a college degree. And we see this also, for example, for Mexico. Again, this is a big change. So the part of Mexican migration that stayed pretty steady was actually college-educated migrants from Mexico. The part that just completely plummeted and has never recovered from the Great Recession is people with a high school degree or less. That's where we just see the big decline.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In terms, I think one of the biggest arguments against immigration that we hear is that migrants are here to take away American jobs. And I was wondering, what do you know about how much employment opportunities have been reduced for the Americans because of migrants, and also whether or not migrants coming to the US affects the wages for different types of levels of employment?
Yeah, so the literature in economics on this is fairly clear, and that there is very little evidence of negative employment or wage effects for what we term native-born workers.
Mhm.
The strongest evidence that there's actually positive employment and wage effects are at the college level. So for college graduates, there's more evidence that immigrant college educated workers are creating job opportunities, not just for themselves, but also for natives. The story about wages is that if they're increasing the productivity of firms or that they're creating more highly productive firms, that's going to translate into higher wages. And that is indeed what we see. Numerous studies have shown that, an increase in college educated foreign-born workers is actually a benefit. And that's very much a story of immigrant and native-born workers being complements to each other. So that's a very economics term. So we like to talk about, this is a question of, are workers substitutes for each other? So the substitution story is one where immigrants are coming in and taking jobs from natives. That would be they're substituting. Another story, but that's not the only story that could happen. They also could be complements. And so that they're not taking the same jobs, they're taking different jobs. And in doing that, they're actually opening up employment possibilities for native-born workers. And so there is a lot of evidence of what we would call like occupational sorting or job sorting that would explain this. Like, why are workers not kind of competing for the same jobs? Why are they actually working in different jobs? And there are some obvious reasons that you could think of for this. Some, for example, if you think of like language ability, right?
Yes.
So some researchers have found that with the inflow of immigrant workers that maybe have reduced language ability in English, but stronger skills in other sets, what you see is that native workers will then move into jobs where, say, communication skills or writing skills in English are more important. And
Yeah.
so, that's a clear story where, they're less substitutability. But even, in fields you would think of where that's perhaps not the case, say in STEM occupations, you still see less displacement and an overall increase. Um, the level of less than college, still there's less evidence of real negative effects on native-born workers. Where you do see that there are negative effects is where you would expect that this competition for jobs would be the closest, where there are substitutes. So that would be among previous waves of migrants who then are losing jobs to newer waves of migrants, and in some cases, less well-educated native-born workers.
Hmm. When I was looking into this subject, the only argument that I could find that that would be the case is for people that are high school dropouts. It's calculated that immigrants have reduced their wages by something around 7%, but that's the only situation where we would see any negative effect, which I
Yeah.
think is very niche and hardly applies to the majority of the US population.
No, but also not to discount the negative effects on those workers. So I think, some of the animosity that you see towards immigration, you actually see coming from areas where the effects are the most negative. So among previous waves of migrant groups who maybe have become naturalized citizens and are voting, and among, you know, high school dropout native-born workers. And so, that's sometimes where you see more of the animosity. But again, actually, economic research would explain some of that, that's the group, those are the groups that tend to be the most adversely affected. But overall, the negative effects, if they exist, I think to your point, the documented ones have not been very large.
Hmm.
Yeah, so much so, actually, I don't know if you've seen The Economist magazine recently had an article on, what did they call it? The new economics of the nativist movement, that the literature on the negative wage and employment effects have found so little. And also job markets post-COVID have been so strong, wages have been increasing, particularly at the lower end of the income distribution. So the arguments of kind of migrants are taking jobs, there's very little there. And so now kind of the anti-immigrant movement in terms of having an economic basis is shifting away from that to other things. They're no longer relying on the argument that, oh, immigrants are clearly taking your jobs, because there's less evidence overall that that's happening. Again, that's not discounting that there are certain pockets that might see it.
Hmm. How is the US labor market in general? Do we see across the board on all different levels a lot of employment opportunities, or are there any niches that's where maybe you don't want to see any additional competition as a American citizen?
Oh, that's a very good question. It's one I don't think I have the answer to. Unemployment rates are really low, have remained low for a while. There's a story about, labor markets after COVID and a scarcity of labor, and that was pushing up wages, particularly, as I mentioned before, at the lower end of the income distribution. Lots of stories about employers saying that they couldn't hire enough people, lots of stories about labor shortages. Some of that has still continued, I think. But I don't know, the extent to which, as of, March 2025, that's still the case.
Hmm. When you hear different I guess, arguments against immigration because of the job displacement. What are maybe some of misinformation bits that are very popular, but they're just egregious in terms of how they compare to reality?
Yeah, one key issue is this concept that there's a fixed number of jobs. So if more people come in, they're fighting for the same number of jobs. So obviously, then that means there's less work and wages are going to be bid down.
Hmm.
But that sort of ignores, and that could happen, let's say, in the very, very short term. Um, but there's a way in which you could think that firms respond immediately, right? More people also creates more employment. It creates more demand for services. If you think of a local area, there's more demand for local services. And so firms are going to see that immediately. Like local restaurants are going to see immediately that there are more people showing up. And so they can immediately hire more workers. Some of this is more long term. Let's say if a restaurant needs a bigger space, that's going to take more time. So you might see that, the positive employment effects could be greater over a medium term perspective than a shorter term one. But there is a way in which more people can create more work. And so that is one misunderstanding. I think this kind of lump sum labor idea that there's a set amount of jobs instead of the reality is that jobs can fluctuate, jobs can increase and decrease. I think the other thing is this assumption that if immigrant labor goes away, that it will be replaced by native born workers and that's going to happen through wages adjusting upward because you have a shortage of workers. And so as a result of that, employers are going to have to push wages up. And so that will draw native born workers into these jobs. The thing that makes that complex, I guess there's twofold complexity. One is that unemployment rates are really low. So it's unclear, right? This sort of giant pool of unemployed native-born workers who are looking for work and they would take it if the wages were sufficiently high. It doesn't seem like there's a giant pool of those people. Not that there are none of those people, but it just doesn't seem to be that that's really, really great. Two, it's unclear if those wages would, say, move high enough. So then now we're talking about, okay, currently employed people moving into these other jobs because they're offering higher wages. And it's unclear if that's going to happen as well. Right? So there's some evidence looking at what happens when firms don't get, so there are visa lotteries for particular types of visas for immigrant workers, and what happens when firms don't get them, right? And so the assumption of this narrative that immigrants are taking jobs is like, oh, well, if these firms aren't allowed to hire immigrant workers, then they will hire natives. And a lot of the evidence shows that they don't. I mean, it's too difficult to know, can they not? Does it just become too hard? I think we don't know enough from the economics perspective of, exactly what's happening there. But generally, you see that these firms, instead of, if they're not allowed to hire more immigrant workers, they just have fewer workers. Yeah.
So if they don't fill that position through H-1B lottery, which is
Yes.
the employment visa, they just don't hire anybody for that
Yes.
position.
Yeah. There's a paper that looks at kind of a parallel visa. What is it called? The H-2B.
H-1B.
So it's
Or
not the H-1B. This is a different one. It's for not highly educated workers. So there's an agricultural visa, a short-term agricultural visa, an H-2A, and then I think that's an H-2B, which is for non-agricultural short-term workers that generally, for example, like construction firms or landscaping firms would use these. And they're meant to be short-term. They're like, a couple of months to a year. And so this is also through the agriculture one isn't through a lottery, but this other one is similar to an H-1B. And so there's this really cool paper that actually follows firms that apply for these, and they can see the ones that get, because it's through a lottery, that
Yeah.
sort of win the lottery and are granted the workers and those that aren't. And they show that the ones that aren't, they just don't hire, and they don't do as much that year.
I feel like often what I hear is that we want to do more of those seasonal visas, but so far it hasn't been implemented and it's happening on such extremely low numbers, something like within thousands of people getting them every year. Um, but I personally feel like that would be just such a better way to cover some of the industries that rely on immigration a lot. I was looking into, for example, construction, hospitality, and agriculture. How much do these industries rely on immigrants? And let's say if unauthorized immigrants, as the current administration wants it, were to be deported, what do you think would happen to those industries?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I looked into some data from the American Community Survey, which I mentioned, and about 20% of all employment in construction is immigrant work. I didn't break that down by college or less than college. It's impossible to know if people are authorized or unauthorized through that data set. Um, so I don't know how much it would decline, but that's a pretty heavy reliance. So, 20% in construction, 28% in agriculture, so even higher. Um, Agriculture is covered by this visa, the H-2A, and I quickly looked, and it seems that there are no caps on those visas.
Hmm.
So, and that the number has increased, about 60% over the past 5 years to now it's over 300,000 are issued a year. Um, so I don't know how difficult it is for firms to get these, and if it is a way for farms to manage mass deportations if they happen. I'm not sure, right, what the composition of labor force looks like. Also for construction, I think there are fewer avenues for construction, so I imagine that's an industry that is going to be much more negatively affected by large scale deportations. Yeah.
I'm curious how these numbers are collected, given that, especially in those industries, it's often a large portion of unauthorized um, immigrants working in those positions. How are we getting the numbers, and how true to reality do you think they are? Or are they missing a large number of people that are just under the radar?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So the goal of, any kind of census taker is to get as accurate as possible a snapshot of the population. And so the American Community Survey, attempts to find as many people as possible. And in doing that, you're going to try and oversample areas or groups of people where you think you might miss them through just a standard survey procedure. Um, of course, so the survey does not ask people about their documented status. So the only thing that you know is if an immigrant is a naturalized citizen or not. Beyond that, and how long when they arrived in the US. So you have some idea of how long they've been in the US and if they're naturalized. But you don't know anything else. One benefit of this is that hopefully you are getting more undocumented individuals living in the country as part of the sample because they are not reluctant to answer the questions. But of course, there are going to be people who are reluctant to answer the questions. I don't think we have a good sense of how underrepresented that group is. I have the sense that it's not dramatically underrepresented. So we're not talking about we're missing, millions of people living in the country who just aren't showing up in this survey. Are we missing several thousand? Probably. Yeah.
Yeah. If mass deportations were to take place, would it be fair to say that we would expect dramatic price increases on agriculture goods, homes or home shortages, and also just like some industries struggling to hire other workers, for example, like meat packing industry?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that. And so this is based on evidence not so much from deportations, but from other programs, to see what has happened to particular industries in response to a decline in labor. So one of this in agriculture comes from a much earlier period. There was a kind of agricultural exchange program with Mexico called the Bracero program that ran from like 1942 to 1964, and it just ended in 1964. And so this was a huge source of agricultural labor for farms in the US, and it ended. And so there's been an interest in looking at, what happened around that time period. And there's this really interesting paper that recently came out. This researcher looked at patent applications, and he found a huge jump in patent applications in agriculture for labor-saving technology. That basically the farms and among like crops that really relied on manual labor. And so he saw this jump, and then he looked at farm data and found that, okay, even with this increase in technology to kind of make up for lost labor, it wasn't enough, and farms shrunk in size. Like they couldn't make up for the loss of labor. There's another paper looking at a program, like an internal enforcement program in the US called 287G. And that also finds just a decline in farm output as a result of this program. And then in construction, there's a paper that looks at another interior enforcement program that, led to a lot of deportations of people who are living inside the country. So not at the border, but already inside the country. And they find a decline in construction workers. Just a decline as a result of that, a decline in overall construction. And so that never has a good impact on prices. So overall decline in supply is never positive for prices. So yes, I think most economists anticipate that it will lead to price increases. The extent to which and how it will vary by good is difficult to predict.
Mm-hmm. One of comments in one of my videos was something along the lines of, well, if then I'm going to start making more money because jobs are going to pay more because immigrants are not taking them. I'm okay with these higher prices on goods because I'm going to get more wages. What do you think about that statement?
So again, I think this assumption that wages will go up in response to declining labor supply. So we might expect some of that, but some of those positions still could remain unfilled. And that would lead total production to fall. There's also the story about a decline in labor supply. So people who are working in the country is also a decline potentially in people living in the country and demanding a lot of services. So that's less labor demand, and that is not going to lead to an increase in wages. So I think we sometimes in economics refer to this as, say, a partial equilibrium versus a general equilibrium approach. So partial equilibrium is you deport a lot of people, nothing else changes. But clearly other things change in response to that, and that's the sort of general equilibrium approach. And that, of course, makes it harder to predict what's going to occur because, say, a lot of people are deported from an area, local restaurants no longer have a base of customers. That's a level of employment that now no longer exists because, some of them are closing down. There's some other, set of firms that are providing different services. They're seeing a contraction in employment. Maybe they're closing down. And that's not a positive wage story for people who are remaining in the country. So it's really difficult to predict, I think, what's going to happen. But the other side of that is that it makes it hard to say that, large deportations will lead to wage increases for native-born workers. On the whole, I don't know if that's going to happen. In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. And so it's hard to, on balance, really difficult to predict.
Fair. I think one last aspect of the labor market I wanted to look into, immigrants don't just seek jobs, they often create jobs and create a lot of businesses. I found numbers around 4 million jobs are created by businesses that were started by immigrants. What do we know from the part of economics in terms of how immigrants are entrepreneurial? What kind of businesses do they do? And do they hire a native born population isn't often like immigrants serving the immigrant community?
Oh, this is a great question. And actually, I must admit, I don't fully know the answer to this. I know that business creation is higher among immigrants than natives. In terms of what employment looks like, I don't know. I can get back to you on this because there's a small literature looking into business creation, and then what employment looks like across what kind of the sectors of those firms, and then what employment looks like. But I don't know that off the top of my head.
Mhm. I also found a number that I think 46% of Fortune 500 companies had at least one immigrant founder. So, in addition to a lot of small businesses that are created, there are also these large corporations that I think shape American economy in so many different ways. Um, the next part I wanted to talk about is welfare, something that Americans are really concerned about. Are immigrants contributing less than they are spending? The numbers that I have found is that immigrants do actually tend to get on welfare more than the native born population. The welfare spending for immigrants is $94 billion annually. And then if we look at how much taxes the immigrant community is contributing, I found a figure of $253 billion. What is the story of how much money immigrants contribute to the government and how much they receive?
Yeah. So I think the concern over the fiscal impacts of immigration come from the undocumented or unauthorized population and concerns that they're not paying, say, Social Security taxes or federal income taxes and or state and local taxes, and yet are receiving benefits in the form of, say, public schooling, safety, road use, etc. Um, so a lot of evidence has shown that immigrants, even unauthorized ones, are paying taxes. Many of them, the most obvious one is everyone is paying sales tax. So that's clearly going in. There's no way to avoid paying sales tax. They're also, frequently paying property taxes in states that that have property taxes on a variety of different forms of property. And sometimes they're even paying federal income taxes through a variety of means. So it's not that, the tax input is zero, um, but it likely is less than what authorized immigrants or native-born workers are paying in. And so then that leads to questions about the use of public services. And I don't fully know differences in use of public services. If there is a higher rate of utilization, again, the big dividing line in thinking about immigration is between college educated and less than college educated. On the college educated side, there seems to be much more evidence that the net fiscal take of immigrants is less. The college educated immigrants are paying much more into taxes than they're taking out in terms of public benefits. You just mentioned a group of people who are running Fortune 500 companies. That's a very high income group. Overall, the college educated migrant population is a fairly high income group. So they're paying a lot into taxes and taking much less out in terms of public benefits. The less than college educated, that's where there's more debate about what this looks like. Some of the debate is on kind of what taxes look like based on income today, but also income projections going forward. So I think some of the projections that, what less than college educated immigrants are taking in public spending, that's greater than what they're paying in taxes, is based on incomes today, which are going to be lower than, say, if someone, works in the US for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, their wages are going to go up. And so how much they're paying in taxes is going to go up. And so the ones who researchers who estimate based on kind of an upward trajectory of wages find that it's a fairly neutral effect. Those that base it on, incomes today tend to find that it's more of a negative in terms of higher use of public services versus payment into the system via taxes. Yeah.
One of the other interesting aspects of immigration in the US that I think is important to consider is that if mass deportations were to take place, some states are especially reliant on immigration. For example, California would be one of them. What do you think would be the impacts of mass deportation on a state like California?
Oh, I think it'd be incredibly negative for a number of reasons. So, one, there's the direct effect of the deportations themselves. As you highlight, um, the unauthorized population in the U.S. is not equally spread out across all states. There's a concentration in particular states: California, Texas, Florida, New York, Illinois, basically large states. Um, you can think of there. I mean, it's sort of interesting because in California, also the presence might be more widespread across different industries. So there might be a larger list of industries that are negatively affected as opposed to some other states where there's more concentration. There's, a clear set of industries that will be negatively affected. So one, there's an obvious negative effect. I mean, if we think about, the estimated unauthorized population in the US is, approximately 11 million. I mean, that's 11 million. First of all, it's not possible, I think, to, suddenly move 11 million people out of the country. But even if it were, that's a lot of people leaving fairly quickly. And clearly that's going to just be negative for a number of communities, many, many, many communities in the US. Beyond that, there's the indirect effect because these are people who live in communities and have families and have neighbors and have friends and have coworkers, and all of those people will be negatively affected as well. So I mentioned this interior enforcement program in the US. The largest one was called Secure Communities, and this led to increased deportations of people who were living inside the country. It's kind of rolled out from 2008 to 2014, and then it was paused. But there are so many papers that have invested, and this is a recent literature investigating the impact of this program on people who remained in the country. The total deportations were about 500,000, so not enormous compared to maybe the numbers that people are looking at now. But the overall impact was really large, well beyond what you would think of as the deported population. So there's a lot of evidence that people who remained in the country became very afraid, particularly among Hispanic populations in various parts of the U.S., that people cut back on work in a variety of ways. Some of them couldn't completely stop working, but they may be cut back on hours or moved into less visible, more vulnerable work in order to avoid immigration enforcement. Maybe not for themselves, but for people in their communities or even their households. There's evidence that parents would take their children out of school or be less involved in school activity, that native-born Hispanic individuals were less likely to use government safety net programs, even though they were eligible for them. So, these were people who could not have been deported. They're U.S. citizens, but they were using these services less. So economists call this sort of a chilling effect, that the fear around these programs lead people to really move away from not only work, but also, key parts of their social lives. And so that has real negative effects for entire communities. So I think there's both the direct effect of the deportations, which are going to be very negative. There's a large body of literature showing that these indirect effects are really large and pretty negative across different communities. And even there's a paper that shows that there was a reduction in native-born employment for less than high school and less than high school educated workers. Again, this story that, in many places, immigrant and native workers are complements. They're not substitutes. And so when the immigrant workers pulled back, there was actually less work for native workers, not more. So it was negative for that group of people as well. So
Yeah.
on the whole, the economics literature tends to be very pro-immigration, that there are numerous positive effects, because there's also a lot of literature showing many, many negative effects of both immigration enforcement and immigration declines.
Mhm. I think one of the one of the main like big criticism that I hear is remittances. There's
Yes.
a lot of money that's sent back home every single year from the immigrant community. What do we know about that, and what are the negative implications on the U.S. economy from remittances?
Oh, yeah. I think as a development economist, the view is much more on the receiving end, right? Like the large amount of remittances that end up going to places and the reliance on this. Also, interest in how remittance changes through different economic cycles. So, interestingly, I mentioned that migration from Mexico is falling dramatically. There's some story about an increase in return migration, but a larger story about just a complete decline in number of people who are leaving. And so that means a decline in the number of people who are going, staying, and sending remittances. But what you see is that actual total remittance flows have not fallen despite this. And so it seems that the remaining population in the US is sending more money. This could be because now this is a population that has lived in the US for longer, so they're making more money, so they have more to send. And so
Mhm.
it's interesting, you have a clear decline in total migration, but not a clear decline in total remittances. Again, I don't know that there's a strong story of substitutability, that money being sent home, this story that somehow is substituting for money that would be spent in local communities in the US. Um, I don't know if there's a lot of evidence on that in terms of, is there a negative effect, say, on the US economy of people sending money home? Again, because it's unclear the story of what would they do with the money. Other than that, I think we don't know of this kind of alternative use, right? What's the next best thing? The opportunity cost of those remittances. I don't know if actually surveys have even asked that. Like, what else would you be doing?
I guess expending on U.S. goods and uh, contributing more money to American businesses.
I'm not sure, because I don't know if you would ask someone like, oh, if you weren't sending this, say, to, your brother at home or your parents or even a spouse, right? Your, spouse or partner could still be in your home country. I don't know if you ask them if you weren't sending this money to them, they could say, well, I'd send it to, maybe they have a list of relatives. And so it's like the opportunity cost is not sending it to relative, 2, 3, or 4 in the home country. So I don't know if you would ever get to, oh, well, I would spend it here. Yeah. But that's
So
an
is it,
interesting question of what people would do otherwise. Yeah.
yeah. So is kind of US currency exiting like the country going to these other places? It doesn't necessarily have a significant impact on the US itself.
I don't think so. No. And not that I know of that I don't know of any study documenting that. Um, Again, sort of assumes that there's money that would stay anyway. I mean, another side of this is that the desire to send money home could increase incentives to work in the US. So people might be working more hours um, in order to, and so they could be working more hours, spending the same amount of money that they would be spending. And then that savings, if you think of it as savings that's not staying in the US, it's just being sent abroad. And so there could be less of a, instead of consumption being displaced, it's savings being displaced. That's one theory. Yeah.
Um, how important are remittances to um, Latin American countries, especially the ones that are close geographically to the United States? Is this something that's significant to those countries, or is just like a small amount of money that they get?
Yeah, no, for large sending countries like Mexico, El Salvador, for example, remittances are really large. And remittance flows have been important for a long time. Um, there's evidence looking at households, say in Mexico, that when remittance flows declined through the Great Recession, there were clear negative effects on different households, so that children, for example, were pulled out of school because there were less money to pay for school fees, also a need for them to start working. One thing you clearly see through the past kind of 15 years of lower migration from Mexico is reduction in self-employment, likely from a reduction in remittances that can be used to start a business. So that was a key source of funding, right? That people would go abroad, gain skills, save up a lot, and come back and start their own firm. And so that has declined by a lot in Mexico as a result. So I have some work with some co-authors, and we show that you see in Mexican labor markets from this increase in people living there as opposed to migrating, a decline in self-employment. So fewer of these people are self-employed and more are working for somebody else.
Is that by any chance it caused by more people staying in the US and just deciding not to go back home because their community became a lot larger over the years?
Oh, so there is a story about people staying that increased immigration enforcement is an incentive for people to stay because it's harder to, if you're going to go back home, you're going back home for good. That the kind of period of circular migration where you would say, go to the US, save up, go back, and then maybe return and save up some more and come back, that has become much harder than it was before. So when you look at the, population, say, of Mexican-born migrants in the US, it's people have been here longer and longer and longer. And what you see is the decline in the new arrivals. Yeah.
Um, and I was curious if you think there is any positive spillover effect. If remittances are indeed significant for a country like Mexico, we could imagine it makes their economy stronger. That makes that country more stable. Uh, do we see like any correlation in terms of like I imagine if your neighboring economies are doing good,
Yeah.
the it positively affects the border, it positively affects the relationship between those two countries. Um, how significant are the remittances for like the country of Mexico, for example? And if there was like a disturbance in that, like, is that something that's very, very important?
That is really an excellent question of the interlinkages across these two countries. They're so deep, and there's so many ways in which the US and Mexico are linked. Um, Remittances is one of them. I think we don't totally know what would happen. There was a big decline in remittances through the Great Recession. But I think in terms of understanding the impact of that, it's really hard to disentangle the impact of the decline in remittances from just the overall decline in economic activity from the Great Recession that affected Mexico as well. So because of that, I don't have a good answer. I don't think the literature has a good answer on, because I mentioned the Great Recession because that's where you see the clear dip in the data. And then it's been pretty steady. And interestingly, through COVID, remittances remain pretty steady, that they didn't decline during COVID. because that would have been another period to kind of see, okay, look, if remittances really decline, like what happens? But we didn't see it then. So we really saw it during the Great Recession. And the problem is there was so much other stuff happening that it's really, really hard to know. I mean, what we do see is that fewer households have had to they have had to reduce their reliance on remittances because there are fewer migrants who are going and sending money. Um, what we can see is that at the level of the households, more women are working. I mean, so this kind of story in Mexico of, largely men would migrate. That's who would send money. And in response to that, women would cut back on working because there was income coming from abroad. And so we've seen the opposite, that when migration falls, that more women are working, and they also are increasing the hours that they're working, and they're more likely to have kind of formal work and less likely to have informal work and unpaid work. So the kind of added worker effect of women stepping into the labor market to make up for lost income from abroad. It's, you know, hard to say, is that better or worse than the previous situation? Difficult to make a claim on that either way. Yeah.
I was also curious about if we have any data on the crime in the migrant community and incarceration rates, and how does that compare to perhaps the native population? Because I think one of the big arguments that we hear is like criminals coming over the border is a big concern with the migrant community.
There is no evidence that there's increased criminal behavior among the migrant population. There is a lot of evidence that criminality is much lower, is significantly lower among the immigrant population in the U.S. Yeah. So on a related note, there's evidence of what happens to overall criminal behavior when immigration enforcement increases. Um, the reason why we might think there is effect is this kind of chilling effect that I talked about before, that people might be more reluctant to go to the police because they're worried about revealing their undocumented status or the status of someone in their household or their neighborhood. And so there are several papers that show that when immigration enforcement increases, people become more reluctant to report crimes. And so crime reporting goes down. And that can lead to an increase in overall criminal activity because there's just less police presence in areas because they're not being told about crimes that are happening. Yeah. But overall, across, many, many waves of different immigrant groups, there's absolutely no evidence that there's higher level of criminal activity. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, how about, like, I guess that large waves of immigration sort of bring cartel activities over the border? Uh, what would you be able to say about that?
Oh, so this is a super interesting question, but again, so hard to know because we're talking about not just unauthorized activity, but illegal activity. So hard, really, really hard to get data on this. It doesn't seem that that's a key pathway through which, um, say, cartel activity is taking place in the U.S. Through immigrant channels. I know that some of the drug trafficking organizations in Mexico have become involved in immigrant transport across the border, sort of unauthorized, like the, coyote trade, like helping people cross the border. Um, but I don't know. I don't think that's linked to then those people, once they do cross, are somehow involved with the cartels. Yeah. So I don't know. I'm sure probably someone in the DEA has a better answer to this, that they track these things more carefully. It'd be really cool to talk to them if they could, maybe off the record, of evidence that they have of some of these links. But overall, I don't think we know that that's occurring.
hmm Do you I know this is a little bit off the topic of economics directly, but I think something that we also often hear in terms of criticism towards more Mexican government directly is that they're not cooperating much in terms of helping US to enforce immigration laws. Um, w- I don't know if you have looked into this subject matter, but do you feel like that's a fair criticism? And is it would be like a fair accusation that because like Mexican government's getting these remittances flows, they're kind of so incentivized and more people crossing over the border that they're actually just like are unwilling to do much to stop that from happening?
So the flows coming from the Mexican border now, the big spike was not from Mexicans. So migration from Mexico, again, plummeted in 2008. And plummeted, I mean, it fell 80%. Like there is just no comparison to the flows from Mexico to what historically they have been. So they fell 80% and they are nowhere close to what they used to be. Like they have not recovered. So the surge at the southern border is largely not coming from Mexican migrants. That's not where we've seen an increase. That is not to say that there are not Mexicans trying to cross the southern border, but that they're not driving the surge. That's coming from other countries. And so I don't know the extent to which Mexico has control over that situation or what they could do in terms of people from other countries traveling through Mexico to get to the southern border as a way to cross, as a primary crossing point into the US. So that I know little about of, if they could, stop these flows at some other point in time. But the flows from Mexico itself have just declined enormously. And again, the level of migration from Mexico that has stayed fairly steady is college educated, and that tends to be more authorized. So that's more people going with visas. That's largely not unauthorized migration.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I was looking into the economics of the new proposals of mass deportation if they were to take place. And what I found is that it seems like cost is extremely difficult to calculate because there is simply no infrastructure to even be able to um, do that. What do you know about, I guess, just like the enforcement cost if something like that was attempted on a mass scale?
Yeah. So I don't have estimates of, X billions of dollars and what it would take. So I will start by mentioning this program that I talked about earlier, the Secure Communities program that began in 2008, was rolled out through 2014. It was paused and then reinstated. So what this program did is that it was a cooperation between local police departments and ICE. The idea is when someone is taken into custody, your fingerprints are taken. And so those automatically were already shared with the FBI to see if you were wanted for a federal crime. So, you're arrested for, traffic violation. Brought in, your fingerprints are taken. So already your fingerprints were sent to the FBI because maybe the FBI was looking for you for another reason. What this program did is that it then shared those fingerprints with ICE, the Department of Homeland Security, who could say, oh, yeah, actually, this person is on our database because we are potentially interested in deporting them. Like we think they may have violated immigration law. And again, this is immigration laws at the federal level, not the state level or the local level. So similar way that the FBI, this is about a federal crime, right? Like ICE is about violating federal immigration law. And so ICE would send a detainer request back to the local jail to say, hey, could you hold this person for 24 hours because we want an ICE agent to go pick them up and then start deportation proceedings because a local jail can't, the Poughkeepsie local jail can't start deportation proceedings against someone. And so what this program did then, it was like the idea is people who were picked up for other reasons. The idea we're deporting criminals, not families, or people who are already in the system. Their fingerprints are showing up because they were arrested for some reason. Well, it turns out, the main reasons for arrests were potential immigration violations. So some people were actually arrested under suspicion of violating immigration law. And then things like traffic stops. So not, of course, there were, major crimes, and that's how you showed up with your fingerprints in the police database. But there were other things that were not major crimes, which is how people showed up in the police database. So that took from 2008 to 2014, 6 years to roll out across all counties, all police jurisdictions in the US. That was just that program. So, and even with that, there were many, many retainers that were sent that local jails were ignored. And we're like, we're not going to hold this person. We're going to set them free.
What I
And
heard the proposal was is to take, like for example, law enforcement from Alabama, the National Guard, and because the governor of Alabama would be really endorsing the new immigration policy, send them to, let's say, like California. And because like the California police wouldn't cooperate, they're just going to send people from the states that are more in support of this policy to conduct those procedures. But I guess that's not something that has been done before much.
yeah, because there's an issue. One, I mean, I think there's kind of a two-part issue of making this happen because one, you have to encounter people to start immigration, to start deportation proceedings. And so how do you do that? Secure communities kind of was one way to have that happen because people were in more direct contact with police. And so you'd have to figure out, one, to have many more police officers willing to do this, which I think is some of the pressure that the Trump administration is trying to put on localities, right? So kind of finding a way to punish them for not complying with these detainer requests. But I don't even know if they did comply with all the detainer requests. That's an enormous increase in just jail capacity. So one, you would need more police officers dedicated to doing this type of work. Two, I think you would need more just local jail capacity. And that's before even any federal government officer is involved in this. So I don't know. There's a whole other level, right? Of, okay, then if you're taking people into a federal facility to start deportation proceedings, like that is going to require more. Who's going to do that? Because that needs to be a federal official. I don't know if there are enough National Guard troops to do this across the country. I mean, I know even at the southern border, they had a hard time hiring enough border guards. Like there's a shortage of border guards because you need people who can pass a certain level of security checks. It's not a great job. So there's not a long line of people who maybe want to do this work. So I think they're going to run into major staffing limitations and also just simple space limitations. Beyond, that's people who are actually encountering the police. I think, which is a small percentage of the unauthorized population in the US. I don't know how they plan to, quote unquote, find everybody else. You can't.
But I guess there's this, I don't know, deal in process for ICE to get IRS, like addresses from the IRS of people across the country, and I guess match that with the list of unauthorized immigrants.
Wow. And so I guess then they would have to get warrants to go into people's houses. You would need, right? Police need a warrant to go into your home. Like the FBI needs a warrant to go into your home or business to look for someone. So I also don't know what that would look like. You would need a warrant to go into millions of homes and businesses, private homes and businesses, to look for people for suspected immigration violation. And I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know how feasible or infeasible that is. But it's not a small undertaking.
Mhm.
Yeah.
What does an immigration procedure look like? How long does it take, and how costly is it to like deport one person, for example?
These are great questions. We need a panel. You should redo this with a panel of experts because I don't know the answer to that. I imagine it depends on the detention facility, how long someone has been in the U.S. Um, no idea how long this can take. Yeah.
Hmm. My understanding, it doesn't take like a couple of days. There are court hearings, and somebody needs to be detained for, it's usually at least like a couple of months.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's my understanding too. This is not a short process. So again, if you're going to increase the size of people in these detention facilities by several times, I don't know if there's the capacity to do that.
Mhm.
Again, both space and people working in jobs who facilitate that process. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I also wanted to talk about the system itself in just like broad form. I have a feeling that just from looking into this for a brief amount of time, US depends on immigration in so many ways, yet it depends on the like illegal flow of immigration as well, and authorized immigrants too, where like as we talked, agriculture, construction, and so on. But there hasn't been almost like desire to do a legal system for that to be met. And at the same time, it seems to be like a desire from the public to provide for that legal system on so many ways, even if we wanted to attract, I guess, maybe more high skilled immigrant labor, so that those like negative effects that we talked about of welfare spending and the wage reduction on the low levels, it seems that so little reform is taking place, even though there is demand for it in the general public. Um, why do you think that's the case? And if you could share like any information you have on that aspect of it.
Yes. Okay. Sorry. This is a great question. So the last major immigration reform in the U.S. took place in 1986,
Hmm.
IRCA. And that was the last time there was any form of comprehensive immigration reform. Um, since then, there have been moves. I forget when the last one was, potentially was like 2008, 2009, that there was a bipartisan group that, tried to get together. That completely failed. And so the last major thing that happened, this was through executive order during the Obama administration, which was DACA, right? The deferred action for people who were brought to the U.S. as children. But even that group, there has been no movement to change the potential status of DACA. One, to have it not be an executive action and make it a law via Congress. That hasn't been possible. Um, and two, to provide any pathway to citizenship for DACA recipients, even those who have served in the military, which seems like the least controversial group. I mean, one of the last executive actions that Biden did on immigration was providing some pathway to unauthorized spouses of U.S. citizens. I think there's an assumption that, oh, if say you're unauthorized, you marry a native, you're great. Like you're good to go. You can get a green card and then through that get citizenship. There's no path for that to happen. In fact, it's incredibly difficult because you're not changing from one status, say H-1B, to a different status, or let's say from a student visa to a permanent residency visa or to a fiance visa or some other form of visa. You don't have status. And so then suddenly you're entering the system, and that is a problem. And so this was an executive action to, provide some path. Say you're a DACA recipient, you marry a U.S. citizen. Um, that was a way for that group to obtain citizenship. That no longer exists. And so even for that group, there's it seems that there's general consensus in the U.S. population that there should be a path for that group. Um, but yet it is just an intractable political conversation. I don't completely know why. Um, And again, it's so intractable that even for the groups that there seems to be large consensus um, that there should be some change, that this is not, DACA recipients are not people who violated the law. They did not make the decision to come here. Some of them have even served in the U.S. military. Um, Even that group cannot get a change in their status. So I don't know. In talking to people who are closer, who say work in Washington and have a better idea of the political conversations, they don't seem very hopeful, which is
Hmm.
depressing. I wish they were a little bit more hopeful. We'll see, you know, if there's any movement going forward out of this new administration. Um, you would think doubtful, although surprising things can happen. So, maybe through very, very anti-immigrant rhetoric, they managed to pass something. That's the only way that I can be hopeful about this. Yeah.
Well, we have now the $5 million visa pathway, so that was
Right. The
it.
golden visa. And I think that group probably already had pretty easy access to the US. I don't think that's changing much in terms of who already was able to access a visa to be here. Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. Um, I feel like it's so interesting how I guess the immigration question has evolved in the political area from some of just also like looking into this. One of the biggest proponents of immigration and a person who wanted to legalize immigrants who were unauthorized in the country was Ronald Reagan. Then, after that whole situation, it moved into a bipartisan issue where it was for a while, and now it's completely changed, which I just found very interesting. And I was surprised to learn that I think right now a lot of people who support extremely like anti-immigration rhetoric also really like Ronald Reagan.
Yes, yeah, IRCA was passed under Reagan, and for a long time, the very pro-business part of the Republican Party was also very pro-immigration, because it meant more labor.
Yeah.
It meant fewer restrictions on businesses, and so the George W. Bush administration was also fairly pro-immigration, but was unable to pass much.
Hmm. Did
Yeah.
you follow the H-1B debate on Twitter, with where I guess the tech entrepreneurs were really pro the visa, but then there was also a lot of debate about the displacement of American workers, and if you had any thoughts on the whole debate?
No, I didn't follow it. I know that the tech industry has advocated for a long time for more H-1B visas. The cap is fairly low. It's like 65,000. Um, there was an increase at one point in like 2004, and then it was set back, and has not increased since. And I know that they have been very vocal proponents of it going back up. I've always seen this as a limit to their influence in Washington, because they're a very powerful industry and it's a clear thing that they want. And there's been no movement forward on this. Um, Again, it will be interesting because this administration has said that they're in favor of more quote unquote high skilled immigration, which is, the H-1B visa is a clear way to expand that. Um, so this could be the administration where oddly we see an increase
Hmm.
or not. It's so hard to predict. Um, but that's the one area where they seem to be open to increasing immigrant flows.
Yeah. Some of the numbers that I found for H-1B from 2024 is 780,000 applied for H-1B visa, and I think 188,000 were selected to meet the 85,000 visa cap,
Okay.
which I think there were just multiple rounds of selection. And actually, a good friend of mine who's an engineer at Bloomberg, extremely high skilled, uh, like high income, high contribution to the American society. Now she's being relocated to London because she
Oh,
was
really?
not able to win the H-1B lottery 3 years in a row. Um, which I also think is just like, if you want immigrants to contribute to the US economy, that's just one of the big indicators that that shouldn't happen if that's your goal.
Yeah. No, it's really incredible that they say, the cap, like you only have so much time to apply for the cap and it fills in like a week. And it's so oversubscribed. Yeah, and the additional 20,000, so it's like 65,000 and then an additional 20,000 for people who have obtained advanced degrees in the US. So to encourage people to get advanced degrees in the US. And then there are no caps on higher ed, nonprofits, and government research agencies.
Mhm.
So, for example, colleges and universities don't face a cap, which is enormously helpful for us. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation. I just have one last question for you. If you had the power to pass one immigration law, um, what would it be?
Oh, I mean, I think the group that most needs a path to citizenship, where it is just incredibly cruel as a country that we don't have it, um, is for DACA recipients. I think it's it's very sad that we managed at least to create some protection for this group. But this is a group that is fundamentally American, um, and they should be able to transition and decide to obtain citizenship if they want to. I think that, and hopefully that group we can, Congress will be able to pass something. Again, not an executive order. Congress has to do this, or it's a law, and that it's more stable. Um, so, and then, beyond that, I would find a pathway for many other groups as well. I mean, it'd be great, to expand and also do things like expand the number of H-1B visas. Clearly, that has to happen, to make this less difficult. But the group that really, really needs to not have temporary status and to have something more permanent are the DACA recipients.
I agree. Well, yes, thank you so much. I've learned a lot.
Me too. I wish I had answers to all of these other things. Let me know if you do a podcast with someone who can answer many of the things that I could not.